Hey, listen! Fairies have been part of folklore, mythology and religion for thousands of years and are still quite popular and annoying. But aside from all of these myths and legends, how would realistic fairies actually work? What kind of biology would they have? And what kind of social structures would they form? And right off the bat, they would be one of the more fresh and new fantasy civilizations that one could craft. Simply because they are small. And therefore, just like old Counter-Strike maps, they would offer a very different perspective on the world they and we humans live in. The trees would be mountains, small rivers gigantic streams, raindrops would feel to them like water balloons falling from the sky to us, a breeze might feel like a hurricane, and a small patch of forest could house millions of them. But aside from this changing perspective, their unique size would lead to unique problems. First and foremost, if fairies are small humanoids, it would mean that they would have a very large surface to body weight ratio, meaning that they would overheat or freeze rather easily. This, in turn, would limit their activities to very specific seasons, or even just a very specific time of the day. Because even just the day and night cycle and the changing temperature this would bring could be a deadly threat to them. So they would either need to live in a forest so large and vast and in such a stable climate that the lower levels of this gigantic wooden sea would create a stable climate of its own, thus enabling fairies to live outside for extended periods of time. Alternatively, they could be just deeply magical beings, more spirits of nature than anything being just made of flesh and blood, which also would be very much in accord with their normal description and depiction in mythology, so that their bodies might just be powered by magic and therefore be insulated to these environmental influences. But once again, if you're just talking about realistic fairies, they would be very busy with just surviving in most environments, because in a realistic scenario, ants would have the size of cats, birds would be like gigantic eagles from Lord of the Rings to them, and rabbits, powerful, strong and wild animals, difficult to control and even more difficult to ride, snakes, wolves, a swarm of wasps or hornets, all these things that human civilization could defend against quite easily, would be akin to dragons and giants to us humans. So a story that depicts a kingdom of fairies with the premise that they would have to fend off gigantic beasts. For example, a mean-spirited house cat, so just a normal house cat, that tries to eat them and kill them for pleasure, or in order to drag them half dead into the house, would still work out, simply because the difference in power between cat and fairy would be quite large. And these realistic fairies would also live and hide in trees, because they offer a much more stable climate and a much more predictable nature and environment. And also they offer very good protection against almost any predator. And of course, those who have to go out in order to acquire food would have a very, very dangerous job. And of course, they would oftentimes travel in pretty large groups of hundreds of fairies, simply for safety reasons. And of course, all those warriors would be seen as brave heroes or madmen. Bird tamers would be celebrated as national heroes, and whoever could befriend a pack of wolves to fend off an ant, or in this case fairy eater, would be seen as nothing short of a living deity. So the fairies would form a warrior society simply by necessity. It's required to flat out survive. The kings and leaders would first and foremost be generals and not rulers or bureaucrats, chieftains and warlords, perhaps aid them in their endeavors. And the actual civil society is then managed by a council that brings forth ideas on what should be built, attacked or defended, in order to secure the food supply and the safety of the realm. Fairies, much like wasps, bees or hornets, would also fiercely defend the tree they inhabit, since their very ancestors inhabited for generations. And just like one bee is not a threat to a human, one fairy would stand little chance of defending its tree. But they will live there in the hundreds of thousands, and therefore they would be able to fend off quite large mammals by themselves. Now they would not aim for the most well-armored part, but they would attacking their ears, noses, and perhaps their mouth in suicidal dive attacks, likely using spears, needles, or wooden splinters in order to inflict damage and in order to pierce the hide of their opponents. And speaking of the tree they are living in, of course elves would make sure not to harm it and to care for it, and while they still would live within the tree itself, they would make sure that no vital parts of the tree are actually damaged, and that all of the vessels leading from the roots to the very leaves at the top of the tree are still intact, and that of course no bug could harm it, and no fungi or illness would take it down. Also, for fending off flying parasites, the fairies could maybe use Canadian oil or maple syrup, as the rest of us knows it, in order to glue their wings together. And if they can use magic, a fireball, even just as big as an eyeball, would do the trick quite well. Though given the fact that fairies live in a forest, perhaps spells of glue, frost, and water would be seen as way less risky. Fire spells might be seen as a last resort, or as a way to deny the enemy their tree, if the tree can't be defended. Thus most animals and even some humans might learn to just leave them alone. As for diplomatic relationships, fairies would profit immensely from humans, orcs, elves, and basically anyone significantly bigger than them. And while the humans could just fry the elves from afar, by using fire arrows or just flinging hot coal in the general direction where their tree stands, or by employing a complete overkill tactic and simply setting the entire forest on fire, I think beautiful, smaller, winged humans would gain a significant position in most human societies and in religions. They could at worst be seen as curiosities to be captured and sold. Maybe they are performing some circus tricks behind a glass window and get in turn a share of the money earned. Perhaps they're also getting paid in food or weapons, or as we humans would call them, needles, and perhaps also in labor, as in the humans will remove a dangerously large rock that sits on a cliffside that could potentially one day fall down and flatten a young tree, thus preventing an entire elfin country, or at least a major city, from being wiped out. Or perhaps fairies are seen as arbiters, as almost celestial beings that could fairly and neutrally judge in trials of humans, or serve as counselors to noblemen and kings, simply because fairies are not involved in human politics. Of course, this could just be a clever facade, and in true fairies run the show via controlling and influencing the royal family, or even having an entire religion dedicated to them, and therefore being officially in charge. In turn, fairies would also live in symbiosis with humans and other sentient species. For example, farmers, be it an orc farmer or a human peasant, could simply be told how these seasons are going to play out, because fairies would of course be way more sensitive to these seasons and changing temperatures and humidity. They could almost, with like 90% accuracy, forecast the weather. Their smaller size would also enable them to build very small things, meaning clocks created with the aid of fairies would be incredibly precise, pretty, and quite valuable. And of course, fairies are still nice to look at, so people might just pay to see them. But please don't put them in a jar without air holes. And with that said, this is my take on how realistic fairies would actually work. Now, they could be much different, depending on how much magical power they have. If they, for example, can cast big fireballs or control animals including magical creatures like living trees, known as trends, or even forest dragons, then they would be a force to be reckoned with, and could easily declare any forest they inhabit forbidden, or perhaps extract tribute by threat of deploying dragons to other civilizations. But these are topics best looked at another time. But for today, this is it, and I say thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you all again soon on my next video. Have a nice day.